This week you're going to hear facts and evidence in this case. And those facts and evidence are going to tell a story. And it's going to be a familiar story because it's a tale as old as time. It's the story of an affair, a pregnancy, and a murder. And the victim of that murder is Gregory Rice, the defendant's the father of 4 of her children. And when you look at the facts and evidence and events that you're going to hear about this week, there's one person who connects all of those things. There's one person at the center of everything you're going to hear. And that person is Meagan Jackson. She's sitting right over there. Now, when you look at Meagan Jackson, you may think, she looks meek, mild, she's a small woman. But looks can be deceiving. And this defendant is certainly deceiving. She deceived Greg Rice. She deceived our co-defendant, Christopher Dantel. She deceived Christopher Dantel's wife, Erica Dantel. And she deceived law enforcement. So as you're watching this, make no mistake. The defendant may look like a victim or portray herself that way. She may look meek and mild, but she is a master manipulator. And that's what she did in this case. And not only is she a master manipulator, she was literally in the business of death. Her job back in 2020 when this occurred was as a body transport person, a body mover. So what she would do, she worked for a company that whenever someone died of natural causes, or if it was a homicide or even a gruesome accident, she would respond in her van and she would pick up the body and she would take it wherever it needed to go. So that's what she did. And in the course of that job and that employment, she met a man named Christopher Dantel. Christopher Dantel was also in the business of death. Before she got the job as a body transport business person, that's what he did. And he trained her. And then he became a deputy coroner, and it was his job, much like Meagan, to respond to these scenes of death and to fill out paperwork and to perform the duties of the coroner. In the course of that employment, Meagan Jackson and Christopher Dantel saw one another very often, and they became close. Now, Christopher Dantel at the time he had a pretty good life, a pretty normal, I would say, everyday life. He worked as a deputy coroner. He was married to a school teacher. He had 2 little kids. He lived in a very nice house in the River's Edge community. And at the same time, Meagan Jackson had been in a relationship with Gregory Rice, the victim in this case. They shared 4 kids. About approximately a year before this murder occurred, she and Gregory Rice broke up. They were no longer together, but they were kind of always connected because they shared these 4 kids. You know, if you share kids, you're going to always have to talk to someone. They would speak about the kids, they would text and call, and that's really what their communications were about. So after Meagan broke up with Greg, she pretty quickly moved on to Christopher Dantel. She set her sights on him, and she basically infiltrated his life. She literally bought a house in the same neighborhood right down the street from him. She befriended his wife. She befriended his kids. She started buying the family expensive gifts with an inheritance she had gotten and made promises of more. She spent her days hanging out with his wife and Christopher Dantel. She became, in a large part, a third party in their marriage. And because Christopher Dantel and Meagan Jackson were kind of dealing in death, they were doing this job where they were transporting bodies and responding to these scenes, they had a reason to be out at all hours of the day or night without anyone raising any suspicions with anyone. They could be together, they could be out all night, they could spend the night, he could spend the night at her house, and no one thought anything. She actually started an affair with Dantel and conducted that affair right under his wife's nose. She was hiding in plain sight, and she was deceiving everyone. So around, I'll say September 2020, a couple of things happened that kind of changed things. The first thing that happened is Meagan Jackson got pregnant with Christopher Dantel's child. At the same time, someone anonymously began exposing the affair between Meagan Jackson and Christopher Dantel to Erica Dantel, his wife, through texts and emails that kind of had pictures and statements about what had been going on. That was done anonymously, but Meagan Jackson represented to Dantel that Greg Rice was responsible for those things. Now, the judge said that you're the judge of the facts, and I'm going to ask you, as you're watching the facts and evidence that's presented in this courtroom, ask yourself, who had the biggest motive to blow up Christopher Dantel's marriage? Ask yourself that question. So that was going on, and then on October 2nd, 2020, Gregory Rice disappeared. A Friday night, he just disappeared. And Meagan Jackson began acting very quickly to divert suspicion away from herself. That weekend, she had an officer do a welfare check on Gregory Rice. She showed up at his house when normally she would make him come pick up the kids. That Monday morning, she showed up at the police department and filed a missing persons report. And in the course of filing that report, she tried to portray Greg as some degenerate drug user, which was the furthest thing from the truth. He basically went to work, took care of his kids, and stayed home. He was a homebody. So she was trying to divert suspicion. But police began looking for Gregory Rice, and they do what police do. They start looking first at people closest to him. So they look at Meagan Jackson. They discover pretty quickly that she's having an affair with Christopher Dantel. The other thing that police start doing when they're looking for someone is they start looking at cell phone records. I'm sure, although I know you're not allowed to have them now, that almost everyone here has a cell phone, and you pretty much take it with you everywhere you go. I know I do. And when your cell phone, when you make a call or you get a text, or sometimes when your phone's just running an app in the background or doing something, it connects to the cellular network and it hits these towers that are located around the county. There's one pretty close to the courthouse you may have seen. And based on those kind of cell phone records, police can identify the approximate location of people, where they are. They can kind of track movements that way. So police began looking at Gregory Rice's cell phone records. And one of the most striking things they noticed is the last person that he spoke to the night he disappeared, October 2nd, 2020, was Meagan Jackson. Police also start looking to see where Greg was. So once they realize that Meagan Jackson's having this affair, that she's the last person to speak to Greg Rice on the phone, or it looks like that's the last phone call he can, suspicion falls on her and Christopher Dantel pretty quickly. But nobody knows where Greg Rice is, because they haven't found him. Now, police know the longer Greg is missing, the less likely they are to find him alive. So as time passes, police begin to suspect strongly that Greg Rice is dead. And lo and behold, about a month after he goes missing, Donna Sue Souls was setting catfish lines in the Little PD River. For those of you who don't know, that's the geographical border between Horry and Marion County. They were setting catfish lines in the middle of the night. They happened upon the body of Greg Rice. Greg had been shot. He had been wrapped in a tarp that was zip tied. Someone had taken ratchet straps and wrapped around it and weighted it down with cinder blocks to try to, and dumped him in the river. So that's a big break in the case for police. It also gives them a new lead to follow. That lead is they start looking at the tarp and the cinder blocks and all these items that Greg's wrapped in, and they start going to stores around Horry County to see if any store sells those items in particular, because those items have tags on them. So they end up going to Lowe's Home Improvement, which is a national chain, I'm sure you all know, and they speak to the security officer, and he starts looking at receipts. And he finds a receipt from October 3rd, the day after the murder, where a person bought all of those items together and I think a Pepsi Zero. So he goes and he says, that's a rather suspicious shopping list. It's basically a murder dump kit. So he goes and looks at surveillance footage, and he finds Christopher Dantel pushing a shopping cart through the Lowe's checkout line with a cart with a tarp, zip ties, cinder blocks, and ratchet straps. And that leads police They start looking for surveillance video. They know the body was dumped in the Little PD River. So they start looking for routes you would take to get there from kind of this area, the beach area where Christopher Dantel lived. And they find surveillance footage from a convenience store, Little PD Exchange, showing Christopher Dantel going back and forth to the dump site in his county vehicle. At the same time, of course, suspicion has already fallen on Christopher Dantel and Meagan Jackson, but at that time, police start looking a little closer. And they start looking at cell phone records, any surveillance they can get. They look at license plate readers. And for those of you who don't know, license plate readers are cameras. A lot of municipalities have them, and the Myrtle Beach has some out on the highways that the cameras capture the license plate of your car as you pass by. So you can tell where cars are on the highway sometimes by looking at these license plate readers. So police start looking at cell phone records, surveillance, and license plate reader to track the movements of Meagan Jackson, Christopher Dantel, and Gregory Rice. And what do they discover? Well, the most striking and obvious thing police discover is that Meagan Jackson and Christopher Dantel were together the entire night of October 2nd, the night that Greg went missing. They left, they met up about 6:30 in the evening at the Lewis Ocean Bay Heritage Preserve. That's just a wildlife management area where you can go, you can see endangered plant species or walk around and look at nature. But what they were there for, police find out later, was target practice. They were actually shooting guns. Meagan liked to shoot, so that's what they were there doing that day that Greg was murdered. They left there, they went to Abuelo's, which is a restaurant, Coastal Grand Mall, you may have seen it. They're on surveillance camera there eating for about an hour. They leave around 8, and then they come back. Christopher Dantel comes back about an hour later, about 9 o'clock, to use the bathroom. He tells police that in that hour they were driving around conducting their affair, that he was receiving oral sex from Meagan, that that's what they did when they were together. They eventually end up at Myrtle Beach Funeral Home. Now, Myrtle Beach Funeral Home is a funeral home. It's on the bypass over near Market Common. You probably know where that is. It's basically a crematorium. Meagan Jackson and Christopher Dantel had access to that funeral home because of their jobs. The county sometimes would store bodies in the coolers there if there were just not enough room at the coroner's office. So they were there, and their cell phone records put them there. Around 9:45, Meagan Jackson calls Greg Rice. And these are approximate times. Around 10 o'clock, she calls him a second time. At the same time, her body transport van, the one that she uses for work when she's doing her job as a body mover, is seen entering the homeowners associations, entering the gate of Arrowhead community where Greg lived. It captured on the homeowners association's license plate reader. She goes in there, or her van goes in there. It stays 6 or 7 minutes and then out. At the same time, from 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock that night, Greg Rice's phone is hitting off the tower near his apartment right there at Arrowhead at Flint Lake Apartments. So it doesn't look like he's moving, it looks like he's home. But around 10, the same time Meagan Jackson's van shows up in his neighborhood, his phone starts moving. And what his phone does is it travels to the Myrtle Beach Funeral Home. At the same time it's traveling, Meagan Jackson's van is traveling toward the Myrtle Beach Funeral Home, hitting license plate readers along the highway, the major highways in Myrtle Beach. So Greg's phone and Meagan's van go back to Myrtle Beach Funeral Home. Now Greg's phone stays there a little while and makes some data connections. So I told you before, whenever you use your phone, sometimes you're making calls or texts, and that's a user-initiated action that causes your phone to connect. But sometimes your phone connects without you doing anything. It can have something running in the background or some app that uses cellular data, and it'll connect without the user actually doing anything. So just because Greg's phone is connecting does not mean that he's alive. It just means that his phone is there. So eventually, Christopher Dantel and Meagan Jackson, you can see from phone records and LPR, start traveling towards the Lowe's Food on International Drive. That's an important location for them. That's where they would go to leave cars so that they could conduct their affair, so that there was just a place to leave the car, essentially. It's kind of close to the neighborhood. It's right by the Lewis Ocean Bay Heritage Preserve where they were going for target practice. And around 11 o'clock at night, a computer store in that shopping center captures Meagan Jackson and Christopher Dantel on camera. Christopher Dantel has a bag, Meagan Jackson's there. Importantly, at the same time, Greg Rice's phone makes a data connection to a tower that would put him in the same vicinity, around 11 o'clock, a little after 11 o'clock that night. That's the last time Greg's phone ever made any connection with the tower. After that, it's just gone. So that's the last time Greg Rice's phone makes a connection. After that, Meagan Jackson, we learned later that Greg Rice was in the cooler at the Myrtle Beach Funeral Home, his body. After that, Meagan Jackson and Christopher Dantel go back to the Myrtle Beach Funeral Home to get they were getting belongings so that she could put some of those belongings to set up this welfare check that she did the next day to make it look like he had wandered off an OD. So they went back to get that. But something else happened that's a bit unusual. When they got there, around 12:45 that night, there was a trade-in bomber there. And as I said, everyone in this case is kind of in the business of death. The trade-in bomber, because Myrtle Beach Funeral Home doesn't have a full-time embalmer, they mostly cremate bodies. The trade-in bomber would come on a contract basis and embalm bodies, and he did that kind of whenever it's convenient for him. You'll hear from him. So he was there at 12:45 a.m. that night. He was there in the middle of the night embalming a body. So when Christopher Dantel and Meagan Jackson showed up, he saw them there. And he'll tell you that. He saw Christopher Dantel there. And they left. They stayed together, kind of, you'll see on tape, they're kind of going back and forth. And then finally, they spend the night together, and then around 8:15 the next morning, they go back to Lowe's Food, and they get in their cars and go their separate ways. So back in December of this year, that's kind of what law enforcement knew about this case. And much like we did here today, Ms. Walter and I, the state of South Carolina, we called Christopher Dantel's case to trial, just like we did today. We picked a jury, the same thing. We went through everything. And then as I was sitting in my chair, getting ready to stand up, Christopher Dantel shocked everyone by standing up himself and voluntarily pleading guilty to accessory after the fact of murder with no agreement with the state. That was also allowed law enforcement to fill in some blanks. Christopher Dantel, after he did that, agreed to speak to law enforcement to kind of fill in a lot of missing pieces of this puzzle. You're going to hear from Christopher Dantel. He's going to testify. I have no doubt that Meagan Jackson's attorneys will make a big deal out of the fact that Christopher Dantel has a motive to minimize his conduct and point the finger at Meagan Jackson. The judge has already told you. You, the jury, can decide what to believe, whether you believe some of what he says or all of it. He's going to tell you that night, when he and Meagan Jackson were at the Myrtle Beach Funeral Home, she called Greg Rice because she wanted to go confront him. And that Christopher Dantel and Meagan Jackson took that body transport van into Arrowhead when it hit that license plate reader. And they went in there, and Meagan Jackson called Greg, and when he came walking up to the car, she got out and shot him and killed him. And the two of them hustled out of that van and put him on their body transport stretcher, and they threw him in the back and went back to Myrtle Beach Funeral Home, where they put him in the cooler while they decided what to do. All of that testimony matches what law enforcement already knew. There's nothing that he's saying to us that is not borne out by those cell phone records, surveillance records, and LPR records. You'll see then too, the next day is when he goes and buys this body dump kit and takes the body, dumps Greg Rice in the Little Petey River. So you decide what to believe in this case. You decide who you think is responsible for the murder of Gregory Rice. Gregory Rice, and you're going to hear from Christopher Dantel, you're going to see Meagan Jackson sitting over there. The only thing Christopher Dantel and Gregory Rice have in common is Meagan Jackson, who's sitting right over there. That's the only thing. The judge is going to instruct you on the law at the end of this case. He's going to tell you about conspiracy. That's just what it sounds like. It's two people getting together to commit a crime. He's going to give you the definition of murder. In South Carolina, we don't have degrees of murder. We have one definition, and that definition is it's the killing, intentional killing of another person with malice aforethought. None of you guys need that definition to know that shooting someone, wrapping them up in a tarp, and weighing them down with cinder blocks and throwing them in the river is murder. But what you do need to know about South Carolina is South Carolina has something called the hand of one is the hand of all. I'm going to read you what that means. This is the legal definition. If two or more people are together, acting together, assisting each other in committing the offense, the act of one is the act of all, or as it's sometimes said, the hand of one is the hand of all. Two people can be guilty of killing another person when only one of the two had a gun, there was only one bullet, and only one of the two fired the shot that caused the death. So what I'm asking you to do is, if at the end of this case, which I think it's pretty clear and obvious, who's responsible for the death and for the murder of Gregory Rice? And at the end of this case, if you believe that Christopher Dantel and Meagan Jackson are responsible for the murder of Gregory Rice, then there's only one verdict, and that's guilty.